And we're going to make up for lost time because I'm not going to detain you too long. What I've got to say shouldn't take 45 minutes. And it's true that I have been writing this book, which is now in press, about quantum mechanics, but it's really come out of various other pieces, which is what Chris and I first corresponded about several years ago, that made me think it was time for such a book, despite the number of popular science books that already exist about quantum mechanics. And in fact, another such piece, another such self-contained article on quantum mechanics is one I'm working on at the moment for Nature, which I've been in touch with some of you about, which is specifically about quantum causality. And it was during the course of writing this piece, it's been a long and tortured editorial process. And during the course of doing that, the editor at Nature, who's desperate to make this piece comprehensible to the kind of molecular biologist who is Nature's core reader, suggested that I might say something like this at one point. He said, could we say, superpositions of quantum states are well known. A photon, for example, can be in a superposition of horizontal and vertical polarization, just like the answer to a marriage proposal can be in a superposition of a loving yes and a heart-wrenching no. And I thought about it for a while, and I thought, well, it's kind of cheesy, but I'm not going to let that put me off. But in the end, it seemed to me that the analogy just falls apart the moment you start thinking about it too closely. It's trying very hard, and I'm trying very hard not to be pedantic, but what I ended up saying to the editor was that really the trouble, it seems to me, is that many of the analogies and metaphors and slogans that have been used over the years to try to convey quantum mechanics to a general audience have become the very reason why I wrote this book, the very reason why in the public arena it seems to me that it's so often misunderstood. And the problem with these analogies is that they refer to the very classical ideas that quantum mechanics undermines, that we keep coming back to them. And let me give you some examples of the kind of thing I mean. So here are some of the characteristics that science popularization, and to be fair, sometimes discourse in scientific journals too, I think, have encouraged people to see in quantum mechanics. So we've been told quantum objects can be both waves and particles, but not at once. And this is wave-particle duality. Quantum objects can be in more than one state at once. They can be both here and there, say. This is a superposition. You can't simultaneously know exactly two properties of a quantum object. This is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Quantum objects can affect one another instantly over huge distances, something called spooky action at a distance. And this arises in the phenomenon of entanglement. You can't measure anything without disturbing it. And so the human observer can't be excluded from the theory. It becomes an unavoidably subjective theory. Everything that can possibly happen will happen. And there are two separate reasons for this claim. One is quantum electrodynamics with its integrals over paths. The other comes, of course, from the many worlds interpretation. Now, the problem is not simply that people are told these things and therefore they believe they're true. That's not how science communication works on the whole. The problem is that these formulations are so good, they're so neat, that they invite belief. And I believe that a lot of science communication and popularization isn't so much about offering an explanation that makes everything clear and understandable. It's at least as much about the packaging as what is in the package. Because in fact, audiences, they love perplexing and puzzling and weird ideas, provided that they're attractively packaged. And that might sound cynical, but I really don't mean it to be. This is really just a reflection of how our minds work. Our minds work not with equations, but with narratives and images. We need stories. Ideally, stories that have pictures attached to them. And I'm talking here, I'm not just being condescending about the general public that people like me are trying to reach. I'm also talking about the molecular biologists I'm trying to reach, and the chemists, and the geologists. And in fact, I am talking about you too. Chris, I hope it won't embarrass you if I say that when I contacted you, I think it was first of all about the piece I was writing on quantum reconstructions. You said this to me. It certainly shouldn't embarrass you. You said, I think one day we will tell a story about quantum mechanics, literally a story, all in plain words, that is so compelling and so masterful in its imagery that the mathematics of quantum mechanics will fall out as a matter of course. So we want stories. And let me give you some examples of what I mean about this aspect of communicating science with these images and stories and so forth. Here are some of the ways you can popularize a complex idea with a neat slogan. So here are some of them. You can read them for yourself. And some of them kind of tell a story. Some of them kind of imply a picture. But what characterizes them all is that they're memorable. They're catchy slogans. They're hooks. They're like those hooks that lodge a tune in your mind. They don't necessarily illuminate the science in themselves at all. And in case there should be any doubt, let me just say again, I'm not voicing this as a criticism. I'm not criticizing the way that science is being communicated here. This kind of thing is essential for propagating science, not just throughout the world at large, but to your colleagues in your department and through other departments. We need it. So I've been writing this book about quantum mechanics, and in particular about interpretations, and I was recently at a gathering of science writers and scientists, and I was speaking to a fellow hack whose opinion I rate very highly, and after I'd attempted to explain what it is that I'm trying to say in this book, he said, so what are you going to call this perspective then that you have on quantum mechanics? And it's because it's one thing to laboriously try to explain what you think quantum mechanics does and doesn't mean, but that isn't going to make much impact unless you can encapsulate that message in a slogan. I don't know, the pilot wave theory, the participatory universe, something like this. And my heart sunk. I realized that my friend was right. So what was I going to do? Well, I'll come back to that. But I don't think that finding the right hook for your idea, the meme, if I can take another example, that will let your point of view propagate, I don't think that this necessarily has to dumb down or distort the message you're trying to get across. But I think it's that happens very easily. And let me give you an example. Take the second one on this list, the selfish gene. This is a brilliant formulation. It's one of the best examples of a hook. And there are plenty of biologists, although interestingly, not so many evolutionary biologists, who embrace it. And they embrace it for good reason. It hints at the important truth in the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology, which is that the living world involves a competitive struggle for survival that's ultimately reflected in the composition of our genome. Okay, so that's fine. But does selfishness give you a really good metaphor for what genes do? Now, that's been discussed a lot, and I don't want to go into the details, but let me just point out that I suspect it leads many people to believe that genes promote their own replication at the expense of other genes. You might be thinking, okay, well, that sounds right to me, but it's not right. And when you think about it, it must be obviously not right. In what possible sense is, let's say, a gene that encodes an enzyme for glycolysis in competition with a gene that encodes eye colour? They're not. If there's competition, it's not between genes, it's between alleles, between different variants of the same gene. Well, yes, selfish geneticists will say, yeah, of course, by gene we mean allele here. It's just that the selfish allele doesn't have the same ring to it. But it gets worse than that, because one of the champions of this selfish gene trope, the biologist Jerry Coyne, has explained why the gene is selfish. He says, quote, he says, the gene promotes the reproduction of itself or its carrier. So hang on a minute, or its carrier, and in fact he should really be saying via its carrier, inevitably via its carrier. So it promotes its replication, but at the same time it makes sure that all the other genes get replicated as well. So that doesn't sound so selfish. But someone like Coyne, I suspect, would argue the gene doesn't care about all those other genes. And then they will quickly add, of course, we know the gene doesn't care about anything. It's just a bit of a molecule. But it really doesn't care about those other genes. And I think that when you see this happening, you realize that these folks have been seduced by their own metaphorical construct. And the real illustration of this comes from Dawkins himself, who in the 30th anniversary edition of The Selfish Gene, he admitted that the cooperative gene would have been an equally good title. In other words, the opposite metaphor would have worked equally well, in which case you have to suspect that the metaphor isn't really doing its job very well. In fact, what it really isn't a metaphor at all, it's a meme, Dawkins' own word, for an idea or a phrase that spreads through culture purely because it has the qualities, whatever those are, that promote spreading of an idea. I'm not going to start arguing about whether memes are actually selfish or not, but that's what the selfish gene is. And the real point here, to bring the topic back to this conference, is that in science, as elsewhere, we crave narratives. But sometimes science has to deal with phenomena that seem to resist a good narrative. And I think genetics is one of those. It's actually an extremely complex process. It's capable of producing very counterintuitive results. In some certain circumstances, for example, it can bring about survival of the less than fittest through just, ordinary Darwinian principles. The biggest problem here, as with many complex systems, is, I think, the one that you'll be familiar with, at least, the problem of causation. And what geneticists, particularly those of a Dawkinsian sympathy, what they're reluctant to confront is that causative explanations of biological behavior might not always be meaningfully reduced to the gene. Now, I think that physicists have become gradually more comfortable with this idea that causation can happen at many separate levels of a complex hierarchy. But they've really only done that through after a misguided period of flirtation with so-called theories of everything, which, incidentally, I should add to my list. There's another good one, another good hook. So I hope you can see where I'm headed, because, of course, narrative and causation have been, they've been central in some respects to what you've been talking about in quantum mechanics here, and what we do generally talk about in quantum mechanics. And by narrative, I mean a sequence of causally related events. So not just this happened and then that happened, but this happened and then as a result that happened. All of our stories, no matter how modernist they are predicated on that idea. Even if you think of something like Kafka's The Trial, which doesn't seem to have that causality, the whole point is the defiance of the expectation that there's a causal sequence at work there that Joseph K. is trying to get at and never can. So causal narratives aren't just the basis of literature, they're the basis, actually, of how we understand our lives. If we can't construct our own narrative, then, it's recognized by psychologists, then we probably have a mental health problem, or we'll be heading for one. So we're pretty determined hunters for causal narratives. And I'd suggest that one reason the Copenhagen interpretation seemed so unreasonable and outrageous, in fact, to some people, is that it denied such a narrative. You were no longer permitted to talk in terms of a sequence of microscopic events that led to the measurement outcome. The photon took this or that particular route through the apparatus, but could only, of course, relate the measurements to the predictions of quantum theory. This, it's true, seemed like a denial of what science normally strives to do, to create a microscopic narrative underpinning observable events, but it also seemed to a denial of how we achieve cognitive coherence at all in our lives. So there was almost an existential challenge to it. And I think this helps to understand why some opponents of Copenhagen have mischaracterized it by saying that it denies any reality at all beyond observation and measurement. And of course, plenty of people like John Wheeler have stated more carefully that what it does is simply imposes limits on what we're permitted to say about that reality. But even that, if we're refusing to grant permission to construct a causal narrative, that seems almost a gross violation of our rights. And I think it's hardly surprising that it created the responses that it did, and that it still does sometimes. And I think this explains a relative lack of enthusiasm for the Copenhagen interpretation when quantum mechanics is popularized. And as Chris said, I think this is a genuine an intriguing phenomenon, because it does seem strange that whereas the Copenhagen interpretation in some form still seems to have more support than other interpretations, not a majority, but more support amongst quantum physicists than the others, most of those physicists who are visible to the public don't seem to adhere to it. And I'm thinking of the likes of Brian Greene, of Sean Carroll, Brian Cox, David Deutsch, Michio Kaku, actually Stephen Hawking as well, and Max Tegmark. Okay, so all of them, in one way or another, seem to adduce a fondness, often a zealous advocacy of the many worlds interpretation. Why is that? Well, I can't say for sure, I'm not in their minds, but I think this much at least might be relevant, that scientists who are content to stay at the level of abstraction and equations don't tend to be the ones who popularize. Heisenberg wasn't a popularizer, neither was Bohr. And in fact, as far as quantum theory goes, neither was Einstein or Schrödinger. If I think of someone like Anton Zeilinger, who I think, Czeslaw, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it'd be fair to call him basically a Copenhagenist. He's written a fine book, popular book, called Dance of the Photons. But it didn't do anything like the kinds of books and the kinds of explanations and articles on quantum mechanics by people like Greene and Cox and Carroll and others. And it's hard to avoid the conclusion that there seems to be a good fit between the kind of mind that wants to popularize science and has an aptitude for popularizing science and the narrative appeal of the many worlds interpretation. And these popularizers have been very canny about that. And I don't imply by that they've done anything underhand or dishonest. I mean that they have, whether consciously or not, they've played to the narrative strengths of the many worlds interpretation. The popular view is that it's a bizarre and mind-boggling interpretation of quantum mechanics, that it's truly weird. But actually the truth is that it works by flattering us, by letting us imagine that there are countless versions of ourselves living out these other lives that we dream we might have had. That's a very difficult image to resist. And here is how it was put in a recent article by Rowan Hooper in New Scientist. He says, "I'm rich. I'm a movie star. I'm the king of the world. I'm also poor. I'm homeless. Lots of me are dead. I'm none of these. Not in this universe. But in the multiverse, I'm all of them and more. In the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, every decision I take in this world creates new universes for each and every choice one for each and every choice I could possibly make." Now, like many successful ideas in science, this one works precisely because we were already prepared for it. This concept is really this concept at least, is the concept of the doppelganger, which has a very long history. It was particularly popular in the Gothic literature of the 19th century. And popular articles about the many worlds interpretation, of course, often make reference to the Gwyneth Paltrow movie, Sliding Doors. But I think what those references are really saying is not, here, think about it like this movie. What they're really saying is they're really reassuring us that this idea does make sense after all, because we've already seen it in the movies. What's more, this narrative focus of the many worlds puts the focus on human agency. And by that I mean, we've heard a lot about agency here. I don't quite mean that. I mean in a more specific sense. The idea that these worlds come into existence because of the choices we make, because of us. And Rowan didn't invent that idea in this article. In fact, he quotes David Deutsch in the piece, who says, in the many worlds interpretation, when you make a choice, the other choices also happen. Or here's Max Tegmark on the same issue. The act of making a decision causes a person to split into multiple copies. Now, I happen to know, because Rowan told me, that he had a heck of a time trying to get the Everettians that he spoke to explain just under what circumstances does this split happen? Does the world split? He said that they just wouldn't say. And I've had the same experience myself. I think there's a good reason for that reticence, which is that it's not easy to give a precise criterion for when that happens. As I understand it, the common view seems to invoke the untangling and mutual isolation of the worlds that is brought about by decoherence. And so you can consider a split to have happened to precisely the extent that you can consider decoherence to have happened. And that view would seem to imply that any interaction of quantum objects that could lead to decoherence is a potential splitting event. And that brings us much closer to the position that Bryce DeWitt attested when he first promoted Everett's views in the 1970s, when he said, every quantum transition taking place in every star, in every galaxy, in every remote corner of the universe is splitting our world on Earth into myriads of copies. If that's so, human decision-making really has no significant share of that market. In fact, it's pretty much irrelevant, since it seems pretty certain that no human decision can be attributed to a single quantum event. And so the emphasis given by Deutsch and Tegmark here is interesting. Perhaps even more so is the response that I got when I asked Lev Weidman this same question. When does splitting take place? Can he be more precise about it? So Lev said, it happens if it leads to more than one story. So, story is the central ingredient of the popularity of the many worlds recipe. And that's also clear from the focus that the popularizers put on the many selves that result. So, here's Max Tegmark on that issue. He says, I feel a strong kinship with parallel Maxes, even though I never get to meet them. They share my values, my feelings, my memory. They're closer to me than brothers. Okay, all right. And of course, most arguments about how to make sense of, this isn't just invention. Most arguments for how to make sense of the apparent quantum probabilities that we find. Most arguments about that in the face of the Everettian deterministic dynamics draw on ideas about subjective experience and the ambiguities of self-location in this quantum multiverse. Some people have even suggested that you can derive the Born rule from that notion. And this is why, when sometimes you hear, and sometimes I've been told, that we should take no notice of all of this, this is just a science fiction gloss on the many worlds. It's actually, much more hard science than that. I don't think that argument holds. It seems to me that questions of identity and self are central to the many worlds interpretation. And I'm glad to see that at least some Everettians, people like David Wallace and Simon Saunders, as well as some critics like Adrian Kent, seem to agree with that view. And my own view is that once you start taking those questions seriously, rather than invoking romantic quantum brothers, you start to see why the many worlds interpretation is, to borrow a phrase that Sean Carroll came up with in a completely different context, needless to say, that it is cognitively unstable. It doesn't support coherent thought. But there's still this irresistible pull towards story and narrative. I mean, both Tegmark and Deutsch are known for saying that we shouldn't worry too much about these questions of whether we can talk about a self or an I or a me or whatever that means, that we should just think about the maths. But as we can see, they're too human for that. They can't resist themselves the pull of a narrative. And it rather delights me, actually, that Deutsch once gave a talk that was celebrating Everett's work. It was in the 1990s, I believe, in which he began with this simple statement. No, 2010, there we go, even more recent. I'll start with a simple fact. In this room, in some nearby universes, Hugh Everett is here with us, celebrating. Perhaps he's there, in that seat. I'll just leave this here, as they say. And I'll leave the many worlds here. Now, I said that Schrödinger and Einstein weren't quantum popularizers, but in one respect, actually, they were both very successful in coming up with quantum memes. I'm talking, of course, about Schrödinger's cat and about spooky action at a distance. In some views, everything that can be said about quantum mechanics can be summed up in the fate of that cat. And I spoke to Rudiger yesterday about this, about whether this was a good way of talking about interpretations or not. I'm not sure. I'm certainly not sure whether this graphic from New Scientist recently does the job. For one thing, I mean, there seems to be a whole many layers of complication that you have to get through about how you define live and dead and how you measure a macroscopic quantum object before you can really get to the nub of what it is that distinguishes interpretations. But besides, it seems to me that this graphic completely misses the point of the Copenhagen interpretation because it forces you to draw a picture of what happens before the observation, what this cat is looked like, whatever that means. And not only that, but it gives the implication here is a causal one, that the observation killed the cat in that case. I like to imagine that Bohr, I mean, clearly this is not what Bohr would have said. I like to imagine he might have said something more like, observation now allows us to speak about the classical state of the cat. And look, it's a dead one. It's the same with spooky action at a distance. You've no doubt seen how many magazines and newspapers still greet new experimental closures of Bell test loopholes with the headline that Einstein's spooky action at a distance is real. Why do they do this? Well, partly because I think they believe that to be the case. They believe that there is some mysterious instantaneous communication between Bob and Alice, but also because there's a narrative pull to that idea. It's so much more of a catchy hook than talking about quantum non-locality, because whatever else you might think about it, quantum non-locality is an anti-narrative phrase. And I think for that reason, that's the reason why the science media uses quantum non-locality as a term with a tremendous lack of enthusiasm. It simply doesn't do the business. So this is what you're up against. Science is like any other aspect of culture in that it's a meme war. And for ideas to propagate widely in the presence of rivals, it's not enough that they be good or correct ideas. They have to be packaged in a way that gives them the potential to spread. They have to have the right hook. And by that, they have to offer some kind of purchase for the mind. If they don't have that, it won't necessarily matter that the idea is fantastic. If they do have it, it won't necessarily matter that the idea beneath the slogan is actually a very difficult one to grasp. It'll still get propagated. So I have to ask, what have you got? Cubism. Well, I fear you know in your hearts that's not going to do this job. It from bit. Well, it's fun, but I'm not seeing a picture there. The participatory universe, participatory realism. Well, not bad, but no cigar, as they say. And I've got the same problem, like I say, at the beginning. So here I am, haunted by my perceptive friend's challenge. How are you going to sell this perspective you think you have on quantum mechanics? Well, I'm going to exploit my good fortune to be here and offer you what I've got. If it's going to get shot down, it might as well happen here. Because this is what I finally came up with as a way of trying to express what the book is trying to say. And I'll just read it out in conclusion. This is how it starts off. It's not a slogan. I couldn't get there, but this is as close as I could get. I like to think of it in terms of a distinction between a theory of isness and a theory of ifness. Quantum mechanics doesn't tell us how a thing is, but about what, with calculable probability, it could be, along with, and this is crucial, a logic of the relationships between those coulds. If this, then that. What this means is that to truly describe the features of quantum mechanics, as far as that's currently possible, we should replace all the conventional isms with ifms. For example, not here it is a particle, there it is a wave, but if we measure things like this, the quantum object behaves in a manner we associate with particles. But if we measure like that, it behaves as if it's a wave. And not the particle is in two places at once, or in two states at once. But if we measure it, we will detect this state with probability x and that state with probability y. This ifness is perplexing because it's not what we've come to associate with science. We're used to science telling us how things are, and if ifs arise, that's just because of our partial ignorance. But in quantum mechanics, ifs are fundamental. Is there an isness beneath the ifness? That's possible. But if there is, it will not be like the isness of everyday life, in which objects have intrinsic, non-contextual, localized properties. It will not be a common sense isness. So that's what I've got. I'll leave it there and do your worst. Thanks very much.
Oh, two fast hands. I think Czaslaw was the faster. Sorry, Richard, twice today.
You would actually ask two questions during your talk. One is, you mentioned these scientists, and then you ask why they are actually, all of them that are very popular and known for broad audience, why they are supporters of many worlds and not Copenhagen. So one thing I would notice that among them, except for David Deutsch, John Corral, Max Tegmark, Stephen Hawking, are all cosmologists. And of course they understand quantum theory, but I think that this was some kind of background why they, working on the universe, wanted to impose somehow even on the interpretation of quantum theory. Could be one answer to that. And the other question was, why is generally more appealing the idea of many worlds? And I think this is true on a larger scale. But if you look at maybe local communities, that very much depends on the whole traditional social environment. And maybe Hans can correct me. I don't know any many world supporters among the physicists in Austria. and I think this has to do with tradition. So, and tradition of pragmatism in maybe even German.
Even I don't think there are any German ever at TNT.
You don't even.
So I can't think of any.
So it could be even distinction between Anglo-Saxons and German attitude to these questions. Sorry about that. So. And also with the fact that maybe its experimental quantum physics is very strong, at least also in Germany and Austria. So if you ask our guys in the laboratory after spending a whole night, clicking detectors and counting, if they think that they multiplied everything into universe, I mean, they will laugh about that. So it has something also very tied to this cultural environment. Association to one or the other.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I hadn't really thought very much about where these divisions and why these camps arise within science itself, as opposed to popularizers of science. But now that you mention it, that's really interesting, and that does seem to be true. And I'm sure you're right that, I guess particularly within Germany also, the whole concept of an intellectual heritage and tradition seems to be much more important than it is in the Anglo-Saxon countries. That's an interesting perspective.
Dieter Zeh, of course, is German, and this whole group.
Right. Yes. And Germany doesn't seem to be averse to talk about instantaneous action at a distance. Yes. A lot of Germans
right.
do say things like that. Richard.
Yeah, you you've got me worried because my own book is just going to come out, and it's not intended as a popular book, but it is intended to be intelligible to a wide readership. And I'm averse to hooks. When I read stuff like that, I scream because it so misrepresents the theory that I'm trying to explain to people. So maybe I'll just not sell any books because there's no hooks. I don't know. But that's the worry. Okay. There's a particular point that struck me recently. I mean, the old metaphor that people always used to appeal to was Schrödinger's cat being neither alive nor dead. But that seems to have got transformed into it being both at once. And I never quite understood why that happened. I mean, maybe it is associated with popularity in the wider public of many worlds talk. I don't know. But I mean, even physicists talk that way now. I guess Wineland gave a talk, not entirely popular talk, where he kept talking about what he was doing with ions by the analogy of a single ball rolling around a bowl, and look, now it's become two, right?
Right.
So that metaphor seems to have really gained traction over the old metaphor.
Yeah.
Of course, they're mutually incompatible and both nonsense anyway. But
Yeah. I mean, I wonder whether, do you think there's more narrative traction in the idea of something being two things at once than something being neither at once? Yes. I suspect it has something to do with that.
The picture of the poor Schrödinger's cat being neither one nor the other, it's not helping narratively speaking.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I hadn't thought about that evolution, but that sort of seems to back up this idea that we have that there is this attraction of narrative of narratives that our hand waving sort of metaphors will be drawn towards. So that is interesting.
So, comments and then a quick question. So the comment was on your on the diagram you put up from of the poor cats under the different interpretations, and you're unhappy with the Copenhagen one. I think something that's going on there is that often, this would be quite familiar, there's a deep ambiguity about what people mean by the Copenhagen interpretation. Often Copenhagen is just used for generic textbook quantum theory, whatever that means, and often that means something like the kind of thing Dirac and von Neumann would say, where you basically have a sort of quite a realist state, and then you have some mysterious but real process of collapse, and you commit to something like the eigenstate-eigenvalue link. So it's a realist theory, but a funny one. So that was consistent with that sort of picture. And then if you say, well, no, by Copenhagen we actually don't mean that at all, we mean the kind of thing that Bohr and Heisenberg said. And if you want to narrow it down more than that, you have to become a scholar. So there's a difficulty in selling the Copenhagen interpretation from that point of view because there aren't any crisp statements of its content. I mean, maybe Wheeler is the best at this, actually, as you say. But I think that's what's going on here. They don't mean what Bohr and Heisenberg said. I mean, they both said the very different things. Don't mean specifically what Bohr said. They just mean something more probably like Dirac.
I wish I had the confidence to say that the New Scientist folks had thought, let's do Dirac instead of Bohr and Heisenberg.
They wouldn't have done that. I mean, I think Asher Perez notes this somewhere, doesn't he? He says there are two things which are called the Copenhagen interpretation. The only problem is they mean diametrically opposite things.
Don Howard has a nice article too.
Yeah. So the question was, when talking about the Everett interpretation, some of my best friends were Everettians, so I didn't understand why you said it was cognitively unstable. What was the cognitive instability?
I think, well, I suppose at root it's thinking about the best way to put it, but at root it seems to me that every theory we have in science, mostly implicitly, returns us to the picture of us being able to talk about it, being able to speak about it. It returns us to the idea of the self. And it seems to me that the many worlds interpretation only pretends to do that, and when you look at it closely, it actually destroys the self. And in doing that, it makes it very hard to use language. And I think, and I don't feel that that's something that one can wave aside as David Deutsch tries to do, because that's how we exist and that's how we communicate. And by that I mean I don't think it's possible to, I see it in papers, and I might have even heard it here when someone was talking about it, the casual way in which it said this observer, he or she will, after the measurement is made, realise that there's a certain probability that they will be in this or that situation. Those pronouns don't have meaning, don't have objective meaning as far as I can see. Or in fact, or to put it another way, the only person I've seen who's really looked at this very carefully is David Wallace, and I think he did it very well, and he concluded that the only way we can give them meaning is to assume that the I, which I suppose one has to think of as the continuous conscious experience, takes a single path through the branching quantum multiverse. Which means, it seems to me, that the I, that consciousness, is somehow the one thing that doesn't follow the laws of physics, that doesn't split.
So that last bit doesn't follow, right? But I take it, so your lack of comfort is with personal identity not being a genuine identity relation, so it's not an equivalence relation. So for you, a genuine personal identity relation is always one-to-one. That's, of course, being denied in some way or other in the Everettian case, so that personal pronouns function, if they function at all, in some different kind of way. So that's where your disquiet is. I don't think it amounts to a pathology because, as you say, I think there are ways, in fact, that these things can be managed. Notice that, for example, with David Wallace, he wouldn't talk about a continuous conscious observer. He wouldn't really care one way or the other about consciousness. People are very unimportant in an Everettian's.
Which is a point of view, but it troubles me because there is no other that I can think of, no other theory of physics that is that dismissive of the fact that ultimately we are here talking about them. That is that dismissive of that concept of that.
There's quietude and there's dismissal, right? So Newtonian physics didn't seem to me to say very much about us. And if it had been able to model stable matter, then they might have been able to find a place for us within it, but it wasn't one of its major schemes. The Everettian view, as somebody like David Wallace or Simon Saunders would present it, similarly says, look, I can model observers for you, fine, if you want me to do that, but it's not the main thing. It's not what the core content of the story is.
But you need to do that in order, like I say, in order to make sense of probability. You absolutely need to do that. You absolutely have to have a clear view of what the individual is if you're going to carry through these arguments about probability, meaning the difficulty of self-location.
So Saunders and Wallace wouldn't talk about self-location. They don't think that's a useful way of developing the probabilistic notion. They've got a different story there. But they would say, look, probability is only important for people who care about probability. Right? So the world doesn't care about it. The world is fundamentally deterministic for them. That's the story. It's a story of a branching world. It's a story of just a unitarily evolving wave function, which, if you happen to be concerned to pick out various structures within it, you'll see some branching and you'll see claim relatively enduring objects with the kind of character that we take ourselves to have. That's how they see it. Probability doesn't enter at the fundamental level.
I know. I would completely accept that Simon Saunders, David Wallace have thought about these things more deeply than I and have raised points that are worth thinking about. I guess my beef really is with the fact that you virtually never see those discussed, and that whenever the many worlds is interpreted, it's interpreted with a very, not even naive and not even thought through version of what these questions really mean. You get quantum brothers. And I think that is reflected in the fact that although that's certainly a point of view, there's complete disagreement amongst others between the point of view that Lev Weidman will say we can only talk about one I in one universe. We can talk about many Levs. Brian Greene will say, no, they're all you, in some sense, that he doesn't really worry about thinking about. And that's really the problem. That it's very hard to pin down. Just as with Copenhagen, it's very difficult to pin down what the many worlds interpretation is. But I absolutely take the point that some people have thought about this carefully.
Small comment. So, I mean, another kind of narrative that I would say that's operative here is not just the narrative that's created by the slogan, but the narrative that's in the background, that's in like the originator of the view, right? So often, one way that like Bohemian mechanics or the many worlds interpretation are presented in the popular literature is like, oh, there's big bad bully Bohr, and then there's poor Hugh Everett III or poor David Bohm, right? And there's that. I mean, I'm not even denying that there's some grain of truth in that. But I mean, but irrespective, there's a kind of background narrative that also, I think, maybe not as much as a slogan, but also.
I agree. I think there is this sort of underdog story that, of course, has a lot of appeal, and and probably also has an element of why the Copenhagen interpretation isn't so favoured in those contexts. That's boring. That's what everyone believes. Of course, it isn't what everyone believes, and it's not boring. It's not even. It's, as we can see, it's very difficult to define what it is. But that's the perception. So I think you're right. Why go with the sort of standard boring view when there are these more exotic ones on offer? On offer from underdogs. Yeah.
When you spoke about, if I can make a joke, when you spoke about the more popular physicists, I think that you forgot just the most popular. That is a physicist, a theoretical physicist working in string theory.
Ravelli.
No, it's Sheldon Cooper.
Other questions?
Not Ravelli, of course.
Well, I'll end with my own question. So your new ifness as opposed to isness. I'm not quite sure how much that tracks with with whatever's going on here. But so if participatory realism isn't going to do it, cubism isn't going to do it, it and bit may. I don't quite remember exactly how you worded them. What would be good for us? Whatever it is that you've seen this week. You may not have an answer now, but on your flight back, keeping in mind that Hendrik may have a small amount of consulting fees, what would put this conference on the map of the newspaper? What would make the New York Times interested in this conference?
Okay, that's my homework.
That's your homework.
But I do think, sadly, that it is a genuine question if you want to propagate these ideas, or at least propagate them beyond Quantum Magazine or something to the New York Times.
Yeah.
So I'll think about it.
Okay. If there's no other questions, let's thank Philip again.